And good afternoon. Since it is technically a few minutes afternoon, I want to call this meeting to order officially, and I want to make some important announcements, which also are requirements. Let me begin by saying that the Standing House and committee rules and practices will continue to apply during these remote hearings. All members are reminded that they are expected to adhere to these standing rules, including the rules that cover decorum. House regulations, as most of you know, require members to be visible through a video connection throughout the entire proceeding. So to the extent possible, please keep your cameras on. Also, please remember to remain muted until you are recognized in order to minimize the background noise. If you have to participate in another proceeding that might be going on simultaneously, please exit this one and then log back in if you can later. In the event that a member encounters technical issues that prevent them from being recognized for their questioning, I will move to the next available member of the same party, and I will recognize that member at the next appropriate time if he or she is able to correct the problem. Again, I know all of you have busy schedules. I appreciate everybody taking time to be here. I'm going to formally introduce our witnesses in just a few moments, but let me just underscore the fact that this hearing of the Subcommittee on Contracting and Infrastructure for the 117th Congress is our first. And for our opening hearing, I thought it was very important to examine an issue that is a priority for government contractors, and that is the interplay between the Federal Acquisition Regulations, also known as the FAR, and the Paycheck Protection Program, also known as PPP. The FAR serves as a primary set of rules governing all executive agencies and their acquisitions of goods and services. And so today we will focus on Part 31 of FAR, which helps contractors determine which costs are in fact reimbursable. Specifically, we'll be taking a look at a aspect of the credits clause, which can impact federal contractors who have taken advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program. Congress created the PPP to help, as we know, small businesses meet payroll costs and other expenses. These loans were designed to be fully forgivable if small businesses spent loan proceeds on these purposes. However, federal contractors, mainly those with cost reimbursable contracts, may find themselves owing the government a credit if the PPP loan has been forgiven and it was used to pay for costs covered under a government contract. So this is by far the virtue of FAR credits and the notion of the credit clause, which is included in these type of arrangements, and more specifically, I should say, in these type of contracts. In April 2020, shortly after PPP's launch, the Department of Defense issued guidance stating that the loan amounts could constitute credits. In essence, the government's position has been to take a credit that is due to avoid duplication of payments. With that said, some small contractors will argue that this is antithetical to the PPP program's intent, which is to help struggling firms during a time of crises. Contractors contend that if the government forces them to repay portions of the loan through credits, then the PPP loan wasn't truly forgivable. So today we'll have an opportunity to examine the varying positions on this critical issue. And during the hearing, it will be very important to note that the Defense Contract Audit Agency has issued additional guidance on the treatment of credits. And while there is certainly room for more guidance, this one represents, I think, an important first step because it clarifies that when a contractor receives PPP loan forgiveness, only the amount of the loan forgiveness allocable to a government contract results in a credit. And so moreover, it clarifies other matters that help ensure appropriate application of credits, of which we will learn more about today in the hearing that is now beginning. It's clear that this is a complex issue with significant ramifications for small government contractors, and I hope that today's hearing will allow us to dive deep into the subject and to better understand all sides of the issue, as well as available guidance that might come to us or that might shed light on this subject, just as the new guidance did today. This hearing is an essential first step in coming to a resolution that doesn't inflict further harm on the small businesses already suffering from this pandemic across the country. So again, I want to thank the witnesses for joining us here today. And now I'd like to yield to the ranking member, Ms. Salazar of Florida, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. It's undeniable that small business contractors play a critical role in the federal sphere. As you said, these businesses are innovators. They drive down the cost by promoting competition, and their flexibility allows them to be agile and adaptable while continuing to deliver an excellent results, often faster and cheaper than their larger counterparts. That's why protecting these essential members of our workforce is critical to maintain federal operations at a best and optimal level. But they're not immune, and they have not been immune to the far-reaching effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, small businesses everywhere, specifically in District Number 27, have suffered from the governmental imposition of endless lockdowns and restrictions. And many have suffered from cuts to billable hours, widespread project cancellations, significant disruptions in cash flow, and interruptions in their ability to perform on the contract. I have spoken to many of my small business contractors in District Number 27 in South Florida that I represent in Congress, and many of them have shared their concerns, including my constituent, Mr. Carlos Penin, who is here with us today as a witness. Many small contractors have turned to their Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP, anticipating they may be able to receive loan forgiveness, provided they comply with the criteria that has been established by the government. But apparently the rules have changed when the Department of Defense, DOD, issued in April of 2020 a memorandum applying federal acquisition regulations cost principles to the PPP forgiveness. DOD has classified forgiveness of the PPP loan as a credit allowed under contract. Now, the DOD has dictated that the contractor must give this amount back to the government. According to the Department of Defense, this application of the federal acquisition regulation may be necessary to prevent against potential abuse by contractors who are seeking a windfall by billing the government twice. This activity is known as double dipping, and we are here elected in Congress to prevent exactly that and to help safeguard taxpayers' money. However, the contracting community has raised several concerns with the DOD strategy. Some contractors argue that the DOD's position contradicts congressional intent on the PPP. Others have taken the view that this unfairly impacts certain contract types, triggering a requirement for payment of the PPP, but for some contracts, but not for others. So many take issue with the DOD's change of rules, expressing their concerns and that they were surprised. This was a surprise decision which was made unilaterally without their consent. Now, as we know, the deadline for forgiveness is around the corner, and they must decide what to do with their loan. For some, PPP may be a welcome and necessary supplement to their existing cash flow, but for others, it may not be worth the trouble, particularly in light of how application of the federal acquisition regulation credit may negatively affect future revenues. So I hope, and I'm sure you do, Chairman, through this insight of our distinguished panelists, we will be able to gain a better understanding of the DOD's stated policy, its potential effect on small contractors, and identify flexible solutions in a bipartisan fashion. Thank you for your time, and I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you very much. The ranking member yields back, and I want to thank her for her comments, and thank again all of you who are here joining us. By the way, if committee members have an opening statement prepared, we would ask that they be submitted for the record. And while I'm at it, I'm going to ask unanimous consent that every member has 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks. I'd like to take a moment to explain how this remote hearing will proceed. Each witness will have 5 minutes to provide a statement, and each committee member will receive 5 minutes for questions. Please ensure again that your microphone is on when you begin speaking and that you return to mute when in fact you are finished. And so I'd like to now introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Greg Bingham, a partner at HKA and a co-lead of their government contracts group. He is a forensic accounting and quantum expert with over 33 years of experience in the field of business consulting, primarily for government and construction contractors. Mr. Bingham is an authority on government contracts, having served as an adjunct professor at the George Washington University. And among his professional memberships, Mr. Bingham is also a member of GW's Government Contracts Advisory Board. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering and an MBA degree as well. Welcome, Mr. Bingham. Our second witness is Ms. Susan Moser, and I'm getting that wrong, but I'll say Moser until I'm corrected. And if I am wrong, please forgive me. Ms. Moser is a partner at Cherry Bakart and the leader and founder of their government contracting services group. Ms. Moser has 36 years of professional experience and advises contractors in multiple areas. She also serves as a regional market leader of the Cherry Bakart's Virginia, DC, and Maryland practices, and is a board member of the Northern Virginia Chamber of Commerce. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in engineering and accounting, and is a certified public accountant and a certified information technology professor. Thank you very, very much, Ms. Moser. Again, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Our third witness today is Ms. Robin Greenleaf. Ms. Greenleaf has more than 30 years of professional experience and is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of the Architectural Engineers in Boston. She is a professional engineer and a LEED accredited professional. Ms. Greenleaf holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering and a Master of Science in Structural Engineering. She is the co-chair-elect of the American Council of Engineering Companies. Welcome again, Ms. Greenleaf. Our final witness, before I yield back, and Mr. Penin, please bear with me because I'm just making sure that I've got a bio on you. I didn't see one here. Okay.
Chairman, I have it here.
I have it. Oh, no, I don't. You do have it?
Yes, I do.
Please introduce him, would you?
All right. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I would like to welcome our final witness, who is from my district, District number 27 in Florida, Mr. Carlos Penin. Mr. Penin is the president and founder of CAP Engineering, CAP, a small minority-owned consulting firm specializing in providing engineering services for government clients. Under his leadership, CAP Engineering has earned a stellar reputation for the professional management of its infrastructure projects, and this has resulted in 30 years of dependable services to satisfy government clients. Mr. Penin has an extensive resume with over 40 years of direct project experience and managerial expertise. Among his many accomplishments, Mr. Penin worked on several major architectural and engineering projects in South Florida, including Joe Rohde Stadium, the widening of the Julia Total Causeway, and the reconstruction of Southwest 8th Street. Lastly, I would like to congratulate Mr. Penin on his recent appointment by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to the South Florida Regional Transportation Authority Governing Board. I wish you well in your new role. And thank you for all that you have done, not only for our district, District number 27, but for the United States and for this magnificent country who opened its arms to you and to your family when you were a little boy. Same case with me. And that's why we're so grateful. And I am delighted to have you here talking to us and explaining and giving us your experience in this last 40 years. Now I yield back, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Salazar. Hopefully we'll make a great 1-2 punch throughout the 117th Congress. And I appreciate you stepping up and doing what you could in terms of properly introducing Mr. Penin. And Mr. Penin, thank you very much, as with all the witnesses again, for being here today. Madam Salazar, I'm going to move to start introducing or calling for remarks the witnesses, unless you have a question or a comment or an observation at this point.
And proceeds to call the witnesses. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bingham, you are now recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. This is quite an honor to get to testify here today. As you mentioned, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, is the primary set of rules used by the U.S. government executive branch agencies. The FAR has 53 parts. FAR Part 31 is dedicated to cost principles and procedures. A key part of FAR Part 31 is what is the composition of total cost of a contract. And that's key to this credit issue. And the cost of a contract is the sum of allowable direct cost, allowable indirect cost, less any allocable credits. And so there is more about this credits point in the credits clause, which is at FAR 31.201-5. Examples of credits are things like state tax refunds. This credits clause is not new. It's been in the FAR since the FAR began in 1984. It was in the Armed Services Procurement Regulation as early as 1948, in essentially the same form as it is today. The impact of the FAR credits clause is different on cost reimbursement contracts than on fixed price contracts. If a contractor incurs $1,000 in cost, generally speaking, on a cost reimbursement contract, they will be reimbursed $1,000. Any event that reduces the allowable cost incurred on a contract will reduce the amount reimbursed under a typical cost reimbursement contract. And a credit is an example of something that would reduce the cost on a cost reimbursement contract. The impact of the credits clause is different on fixed price contracts. In fixed price contracts, the invoicing and payment provisions generally focus on the contractor demonstrating it provided some specified product or service and requesting payment of a predetermined price. And so if the contractor incurs more cost or less cost, they still get that predetermined price on a fixed price contract. So a credit will reduce a particular contract's cost and reduce the amount paid on a cost reimbursement contract, but not on a fixed price contract. As an example, let's say contractor A works solely with the federal government and holds only fixed price contracts. Contractor A has a PPP loan worth $1 million forgiven in 2020. There would be no repayment to the government for any of the forgiven loan in this example. Contractor B works solely with the federal government and holds only cost reimbursement contracts. Contractor B had a PPP loan worth $1 million forgiven in 2020. Contractor B would repay the government for this forgiven loan under this scenario. There are different types of cost. The major categories of cost are direct and indirect. And direct costs are people that are actually working on contracts. Sometimes the labor of people working on contracts is referred to as touch labor because their hands are actually, the mechanic's hands are actually touching the car. Or on the assembly line, people are actually performing the work. Indirect costs are people that are for costs that are not working on the contract, they're more for the going concern of the company. And so things, typical indirect costs are things like facility rent or the salary and benefits of the office administrator that works in the office and benefits all contracts, not one doesn't work on any particular contract and benefits all contracts. Indirect costs are often expressed in terms of an indirect cost rate. So that is, an indirect cost rate is the ratio of indirect costs to direct costs. So remember, numerator, denominator, top of the ratio, bottom of the ratio. The indirect costs are on top and the direct costs are on the bottom in a typical example. And so you might have, it might be expressed as a rate something like 5%. For years that have already passed, a company can determine all of the direct costs and indirect costs that were incurred in this prior year. And so in a typical process, after these costs are audited by the government, the company and the government negotiate a final settlement of what was the indirect cost rate for that prior year. There are things called forward pricing rates. And so for years that are not yet completed, as 2021 is now not completed, and for years which have not yet commenced, government contractors often develop estimates of the total amount of indirect and direct costs that will be incurred over the course of the year. It should not be assumed that future years will have exactly the same indirect cost rate as a prior year. There can be non-recurring events, and the forgiveness of a PP loan in 2020 may well be a non-recurring event. It may be an event that occurs in 2020 that you do not anticipate will occur in future years. And if that's the case, then 2021, the indirect rates for 2021 and future years shouldn't be based kind of solely or blindly on whatever the experience was in 2020. And with that, I will
Mr.
Yes?
You probably looked at the clock and started wrapping up, but we have exhausted the amount of time for you. If you would let us get through the others, I'm sure there are going to be some questions directed your way. And again, I appreciate your understanding.
Certainly, certainly. Thank you for this opportunity.
Sure. Questions now for Ms. Moser. Ms. Moser, again, I know I've said it several times. If I'm mispronouncing your name, please correct me, because with a name like mine, I can't afford to do that. You're muted.
Thank you. Chairman Mafumi, Ranking Member Salazar, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Susan Moser, and I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about the government's guidance on PPP forgiveness and its impact on contractors today and moving forward. As was previously mentioned, the interaction between the FAR and PPP was first addressed in April 2020 when DoD answered a frequently asked question and made clear that DoD expected PPP loan forgiveness would result in a credit to the government on flexibly priced contracts. Subsequent to this guidance, confusion began as most companies have a mix of flexibly priced and firm fixed price contracts, and many contractors plan to only seek forgiveness of certain costs, which could be a mix of direct and indirect costs. While the impact of PPP forgiveness on flexibly priced contracts has been made clear, the contractor community needs clarity around how to handle forgiven costs under other contract arrangements, including contracts with state transportation agencies. To date, agencies have issued limited guidance with conflicting information that contractors are struggling to understand and apply. DCAA did issue guidance, revised guidance in January 2021 that confirmed that credits should be recorded based on how costs were recorded when incurred. DCAA also stated that a PPP loan forgiveness credit should be allocated to the accounting period in which it is received. The guidance is contrary to generally accepted accounting principles and at least 2 decisions by the Federal Court of Claims and its predecessor court. For most companies, forgiveness for costs incurred in 2020 will occur in 2021. I'd also like to note that the impact of the employee retention credit creates the same challenges for contractors. Much of the concern regarding guidance has come from architectural and engineering or A&E firms doing business with state transportation agencies who receive funding from the Federal Highway Administration. These contracts carry many FAR requirements. There is a concern with potential draft guidance being considered by the Highway Administration that would require all PPP forgiveness credits to be applied to indirect costs. Accounting for credits in this way is inconsistent with FAR Part 31 and would result in reduced indirect rates for the year in which the credit is applied, but could also apply throughout the life of multiple year contracts awarded in the year in which the reduced rates were established, potentially resulting in reduced indirect rates for multiple years. Understandably, many A&E firms are concerned with the implications of this anticipated guidance. Most state Department of Transportation agencies require A&E firms to have an indirect rate audit conducted by a CPA firm. My firm performs many of these types of audits. State DOTs are trying to get guidance from the Federal Highway Administration, but absent that, are advising to rely on existing regulations in determining credits. There are 3 areas where guidance could assist contractors. First, standardizing the period in which the PPP credit should be recorded and included in any indirect rate audit. The credit should be included in the same year the costs were incurred. Second, I recommend that any contractor receiving PPP funds disclose in the notes to their indirect rate audit the calculated rate both with and without forgiveness considered. Lastly, inform procurement agencies, particularly transportation, that rates included in indirect rate audits should be used in negotiations, but that final prices can and should incorporate consideration of the impact of PPP forgiveness. Specifically, while the rate including PPP forgiveness can be used in 1 year of a multiple year contract, subsequent years should be renegotiated using rates that are not impacted by the PPP credit. Contracting agencies should also incorporate business judgment in negotiating a price that is fair and reasonable to both parties. These recommendations, I believe, align with generally accepted accounting principles, the FAR cost principles, and would help alleviate negative financial impacts in subsequent years. Further, this would reduce confusion while also ensuring contractors receive the benefit originally intended by the CARES Act, but without the potential to double dip and allow some contractors to receive a greater benefit than companies who do not contract with the government. Thank you very much for your time today.
Mr. Mfume, you're muted.
I was thanking all the witnesses for their testimony so far and reminding people that we all have their written testimony. If they have it nearby, I would urge that you hold on to it because there may be some questions, comments, and observations that go directly back to that. I'd like to recognize Ms. Greenleaf at the current moment. Ms. Greenleaf, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman Mfume and Ranking Member Salazar. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today. My name is Robin Greenleaf. I'm the CEO of Architectural Engineers, Inc., a woman-owned engineering firm in Boston. We have 33 employees who provide mechanical and electrical engineering services to federal, state, and local agencies and private companies and owners. I'm also the chair-elect of the American Council of Engineering Companies, and I'll have the privilege of serving as national chair starting in April. It's an honor to represent my colleagues here today. I can't overstate how important this issue is to small business engineering firms across the country right now. My 2020 experience is typical of hundreds and hundreds of my colleagues in the industry. We relied on the PPP loan to keep our entire staff on the payroll, even in the face of significant business disruptions and revenue loss. And the program was successful. It met its intended objective. But now those of us who contract for government clients are facing the imposition of a credit under the FAR, and we think this is completely misguided. Congress already made clear that forgiven PPP loans are not to be treated as income for tax purposes, and then further clarified that covered expenses are deductible. In the same way, forgiven PPP loans ought not to count as income under the FAR. This was emergency relief to support employers, and our businesses ought to be able to take full advantage of the program. There are numerous challenges with this policy that I want to highlight for you. One, if this credit is applied to reduce our overhead rate, as proposed by the Federal Highway Administration, we're going to be working at a discounted rate, not only in the coming year, but potentially for several years. Many of our clients lock in the indirect cost rate over the life of a multi-year contract. On my $594,000 PPP loan, on which we just received forgiveness last week, I'm looking at a 32% drop in my overhead rate, resulting in a loss of at least $129,000 per year. Only about 15% of my firm's work is with public agencies using our FAR rate. For firms that do predominantly DOT work, it's easy to see how the losses will far exceed the value of the loan. This leads to my second point. The impact of the credit will fall most heavily on small, minority-owned, and women-owned firms that needed the assistance the most and who tend to perform a higher percentage of government contracting. I've documented a few examples in my written testimony, and I hear from more colleagues every day. In fact, the basic outcome of this policy is that our state and local clients will be benefiting from the PPP, not us. We're passing the loan through to them through discounted billing rates. If unchanged, the application of this credit will create a disincentive for women-owned firms, minority-owned firms, DBEs, and other small businesses to compete for work for public agencies. It will deprive the government of qualified engineering services and will hamper efforts to expand small business and DBE contracting opportunities. Let me also say that the inequity here with our counterparts in the infrastructure market is frustrating. Other contractors working on federal aid projects are not subject to these same requirements. Fixed price contracts are not impacted by the FAR credits clause. While my rates are reduced, other businesses working on the same infrastructure projects have been able to retain the full benefit of the PPP. This uneven treatment does not seem fair or equitable. There's a real sense of urgency in the industry to get this issue resolved. Firms that already received forgiveness are starting the annual audit process and seeing the impact of the credit on their rates. Some business owners are already questioning whether they can continue to keep all their employees that they supported with the PPP loan. Those that have not yet applied for forgiveness are coming up on the 10-month deadline to start repaying those loans. Banks are pressuring them to decide whether to apply for forgiveness. Our small business owners need to make critical business decisions about the impact on their rates and projected revenues and employment ramifications. At a time when the industry is very eager to work with you and your colleagues to deliver a robust infrastructure-based economic recovery agenda, your prospects for these opportunities are dimmer because of this credit holding us back. And thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Ms. Greenleaf. Mr. Penin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mfume, Ranking Member Salazar, all congressional members of the Subcommittee on Contracting and Infrastructure, and everyone present. My name is Carlos Penin. I arrived from Cuba in 1962 at the age of 6. I think I'm giving away my age. But I'm a proud Cuban American who pursued a career in engineering and ended up fulfilling my American dream of starting my own business. The company that I started, CAP Engineering, is a small minority-owned business that has been in operation in the city of Coral Gables, District 27, for almost 32 years. Today, I'm addressing this committee as the founder president of my company, representing my employees, but also as a former president of ACEC Florida, the organization that represents member engineering firms in the state of Florida. In Florida, we have hurricanes, and I've survived multiple hurricanes during our company's history, sometimes multiple hurricanes in the same year. The devastation from this pandemic has been far worse, and nobody could have even predicted it. Nobody saw it coming, and the severe impact that it has had. In the early months of the pandemic, we applied for and received assistance from the PPP. The assistance that we received was applied as intended to help keep our loyal staff employed so that they, in turn, could keep their families fed, safe, and healthy. The interpretation of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR clause, would reverse the benefits received from the PPP and could have a negative impact for my company and any company that pursues federal or state contracting for years to come. As Robin so well pointed out, if the PPP loan forgiveness is unallowed and therefore subtracted from the indirect labor cost, then in our case, our overhead rate would be reduced by approximately 25%. If we had multi-year contracts, the lower overhead rate would be applied for multiple years and for multiple contracts. This reduction would be higher than the original loan amount that we received, thus negating the original intent of the PPP loan, which was to help companies such as ours keep our employees and thus help our families. I ask you to please consider our industry's request that this unintended consequence be eliminated. And as good engineers, we're supposed to finish on time and under budget, and I yield back with 2 minutes and some seconds left over in my 5-minute presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And my thanks to all of the witnesses. We're going to begin the open session of questions and comments with members who are present today. And I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bingham, could you go back and elaborate on what the credit clause is and how it's supposed to work, and how are federal contractors bound by the principal clause?
Certainly. A key issue for reimbursement of cost and for just cost accounting generally is what is the cost recorded on a contract. And the cost recorded on a contract is direct cost plus indirect cost, less any credit. So the issues that are being discussed here relate, when people talk about paying their employees, that may well be a direct cost. It's hard to know if there are indirect employees, but it could well be direct cost of performance. If they talk about paying for the facilities cost or their indirect personnel, then that would be part of their indirect cost. But the credit, wherever the loan money is spent, that's where the credit should go. So if a company uses the loan for a particular contract, only to reimburse employees on a particular contract, then the credit should go to that particular contract, not other contracts, not to overhead. If the credit went all to facilities cost and overhead, then the forgiveness should go only to overhead. But I hope that helps you understand that in determining the cost on a contract, the credit has to be reduced from wherever the loan was spent. That's where the reduction occurs.
Okay. And Ms. Moser, I want to just stay on that matter regarding these credits. You mentioned in your testimony that DCAA issued guidance on how the credit should in fact be applied. Could you take a moment and expound on the major points of that guidance and how it really works in practice?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So DCA issued its guidance in January, which had a number of different areas that they addressed. The first area is they were clear, and this is consistent with the earlier DoD guidance and consistent with the testimony we just heard, that loan forgiveness proceeds should be applied in the same manner in which the original cost was incurred. So just as we heard before, if direct salaries were used, and it could be on for commercial work or on direct cost reimbursable work, that portion of the credit should go back to that where it was originally incurred. If it was included in the overhead, that's where it should be incurred. So that was pretty straightforward, and I think consistent with the FAR. DCA's guidance suggested or stated that, and DCA, when they issue guidance, they're actually issuing guidance to their auditors. The general public and contractors certainly uses it as a reference, but they're issuing guidance to their auditors. But they also stated that the credit, when the credit is received, is the year in which it should be applied. So that creates some inconsistency. Most companies are incurred the loan forgiveness PPP during 2020, and they're going to get proceeds in forgiveness in 2021. That matching, that inconsistent matching, I believe is not correct. They also did address a number of other areas in their guidance, including guidance on forward contractors doing forward pricing. So a forward pricing rate agreement is a forward-looking forecast of rates that's used for certain types of contracts. It's typically used in negotiating fixed price task orders or change orders. So they did include in their guidance that consideration should be given to how, 2020, we've all acknowledged, was an unusual year with unusual circumstances, and costs incurred and credits incurred in those years should be considered in looking at forward-looking, meaning just because historical reference is not necessarily the projection of what the future rates would be. So those were the primary areas they addressed.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moser. My time has expired. Chair will recognize the ranking member, Ms. Salazar.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I want to use my 5 minutes. Maybe I can ask the same question to the different witnesses. I would start with Mr. Penin, and then I can ask Mrs. Moser. I think that the main concern the government has is to avoid the double dipping. So if you were in our position, what would be your recommendation? I'm sure Mr. Penin, Mrs. Moser, I'm sure that all of you do not want that from happening. We do not want to have to pay twice. So what would we, in which way we could be able to be fair to you, but at the same time, not pay you double? We start with you, Mr. Penin.
Thank you very much for the question, Ranking Member Salazar. That is more of an accounting function. I don't think that it's double dipping. We used the loan for what it was intended to be used, which was to save our employees, and we did that. When we sought the PPP funding, we looked at it as the lifeline to get to the other side of the pandemic. And that, as we've heard it oftentimes, that goalpost kept moving on us over and over again. So it was a vital opportunity for us to be able to stay alive, stay afloat during this last year. As far as the FAR and how that's used, as I mentioned in my testimony before, that is it has a negative impact to the bottom line, because what happens is it gets applied to the indirect labor cost, and therefore it pushes our multiplier down. And in some cases, as I will experience in my company, it will put us at 25% below what we're currently doing today. So we see we see this as a loan slash a forgivable loan that has carried us through last year. It's not reoccurring, but the unintended consequence could reoccur for multiple years to come. I hope that answers your question.
Sure. Yes, thank you. Why don't we then ask Mrs. Moser?
Hi, yes. So the FAR incorporates the cost principles into certain types of contracts. So specifically the flexibly priced contracts, cost type contracts, and time and materials contracts. And I don't think waiving the credits clause, carte blanche, related to PPP is the appropriate thing to do, because it could lead to unintended consequences, and it could provide a situation where contractors that have only flexibly priced contracts would double dip. Basically, they're billing the government for all of their costs incurred, and then they're getting the forgiveness. And so I don't think people want that to happen, certainly not as a taxpayer. I think the challenge is that the cost principles are referenced in many other types of contracts. And a lot of what we're hearing is regarding state transportation contracts. And so my recommendation is really it's not a waiver of the FAR credits clause. It's really about issuing better guidance and explaining the situation so that contractors negotiating with state transportation agencies, for example, have all of the information about the impacts that, the rate needs to be calculated as the rate is consistent with the FAR, but how that rate is utilized in subsequent years, I think, is really where the guidance is needed. So, the timing of the guidance from DCA, I think, is a problem. And then I think the lack of guidance or concerns about proposed guidance that might be issued from the Highway Administration, that's really where I think the focus is. One of the, when guidance is issued by audit agencies, they don't seek public comment. And with lots of proposed regulations, there's public comment and an opportunity for people to weigh in. And I think, that certainly would be could be helpful to this process to improve.
So it's not necessarily an accounting issue according to what you're saying, but it's just clarification.
So I think the accounting in terms of how the credits clause should be applied is clear and doesn't require a change. I think it's the application of how that credits clause, the reality is how those rates are utilized in subsequent years' contracts.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. The chair would like to recognize Representative Golden from the state of Maine. Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'll start with Ms. Moser, and I wanted to ask if there are other examples out there in addition to the PPP program where we have COVID-related federal assistance for which a contractor might have to provide the government with a credit. And if the answer is yes, could you also elaborate a little bit about why?
Yes, I'll be happy to. I think the most immediate additional assistance is the employee retention credit. So when the employee retention credit was first incorporated into the CARES Act, companies that received PPP loans were not eligible for the employee retention credit. So for most contractors, PPP was that lifeline, that immediate assistance that they were seeking, is that they really didn't focus on the employee retention credit. With the legislation that passed in December, that made available the employee retention credit for companies that also receive PPP loans. The employee retention credit is a credit against payroll taxes. So consistent with the credits clause, so a company that is a contractor that has flexibly priced contracts, cost contracts, if they are eligible to receive an employee retention credit, it is a reduction against the payroll taxes that they pay. So it would be treated consistently if they originally recorded the payroll taxes, say in 2020, when they paid them, it would go to a fringe. Usually that's an indirect expense considered a fringe benefit. When you receive the credit, it should be applied back the same in a similar manner. So it is a very similar situation.
Thank you. I think that's helpful. Ms. Greenleaf, you testified that you thought that engineering firms in particular would have difficulty compared to other contractors that also do businesses with state departments of transportation. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit further on that. And secondly, wanted to ask if you felt that should Congress mandate DOT to issue guidance that would ensure that indirect cost rates were trued up based on what a firm's real indirect costs were for the year impacted by the credit, would that address ACEC's concerns?
So to answer your first question, I think that engineering firms in general, many of us work for state DOTs. And so the draft guidance that's come out from Federal Highway at this point is taking a very hardcore approach to how to deal with the PPP credit. So it's one reason why we're pushing back so hard on this issue. there's also so many, we're part of a very narrow band of impacted professions that are feeling the pressure from the FAR credit clause. It doesn't extend far beyond just those of us who work for state DOTs. And so based on that, that's why we are wanting to just see the loan be completely forgiven and not have to apply the credit. So having said that, and I think I'm going to need to ask you to repeat your second part of your question, and then I'll come right back to you.
Yes, if Congress were to mandate that the Federal Department of Transportation issue guidance that would ensure that indirect cost rates were more accurately reflecting a firm's real indirect costs for the year impacted by the credit, would that in any way address the concerns of your organization?
I don't know that it does. And the reason for that is that the state DOTs, and that's largely who we're talking about, are inconsistent across the country in their ability to do the truing up on an annual basis. And I can tell you from personal experience in Massachusetts that the work that I do here, we are put in what is the equivalent of multi-year contracts. The overhead rate does not change. It's very difficult to get an audit to request the change. And I think that based on that, what we could expect is just a lot of inconsistency across the DOT's abilities to do the truing up and to do annual audits.
That's very helpful. I see I only have 10 seconds left, so I will yield back 8 seconds.
Thank you very much, Representative Golden. Chair would now recognize Mr. Stauber. Did we lose him? Okay, well, maybe he'll jump back in. Okay, Mr. Stauber is out. Chair recognizes, Ms. Salazar, I don't see any other members from your side of the aisle.
Yeah, you
am I missing someone?
Yeah, they had other committee meetings going on at the same time. And myself, I have to go to Foreign Relations, but I'm staying here with you until you have finished with all the testimonies.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzgerald is here though, and I'd like to recognize Mr. Fitzgerald for 5 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Just real quick to Mr. Carlos Penin. I understand today we're kind of focused on the PPP stuff, but in the COVID bill that recently passed, it did include some language on section 3610 that authorized agencies to address contractor employee salaries. I was wondering if you had any comments on that. It's kind of related to catastrophic events is what my understanding is. I don't know more than that about it. But I just wondered if you could provide any insight into the impact that you have.
Thank you for the question, Congressman Fitzgerald. I am not familiar with the new legislation and therefore not going to be helpful to you on that. I'm not read it.
Very good. It's kind of a struggle, and I think a lot of us have been caught off guard because the legislation just signed into law. But I would urge the chair and the ranking member. I think it is something that we need to probably take a look at and hopefully because it seems to be boiling up right now. So thank you, and I'll yield back. Thank you.
Chairman?
Yes.
Excuse me, I think we do have Congressman Moser with us. Is that correct? So we can recognize him?
Yes. We will first recognize Ms. Newman for her 5 minutes, and then we will come back to Representative Moser. Ms. Newman.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Salazar. So this is a very timely issue in my district. Dozens of small businesses have come forward to talk about this with us. So I'm so glad for the testimony today, and thank you to all the witnesses. It's been very helpful to dimensionalize this for me. So I have a couple of questions, and I think I'd like Ms. Moser and Mr. Penin to answer them. And I'm going to go to Mr. Penin first. So it clearly seems like there's an issue here that can be addressed. And I don't think it has to be brain surgery. What is your recommendation? Does it need to be a clarification of rules? Is it regulatory, or do you think that it requires congressional intervention? And I'll go to Mr. Penin first.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Newman, and thank you for your concerns for your district as well. I think that for us, it's probably a clarification of the language and how it's being applied more so than an act of Congress. I'm trying to keep it simplified because it's, if we start getting too many people involved, it starts to muddle the situation. But I would think that it's something that can be handled as long as there is a clarification of the interpretation. And I think that would be the easiest way of handling it. Certainly would serve our purpose on the industry side to have that resolved. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, and then I'd like to go to Ms. Moser from a technical standpoint, from an accounting perspective. What would your remedy be?
Yes, thank you. So I agree with Mr. Penin. I don't believe that there is legislative action that's needed to rectify this situation. I think that could end up with unintended consequences. I really think it's an issue of clarification on guidance. The DCAA, as I mentioned, their guidance is issued to auditors. So while I disagree, and I think it's an incorrect guidance on the timing of the application, ultimately contracting officers make those recommendations. So DCAA is making recommendations to its auditors. Contractors, if they don't agree with that, ultimately it's up to a contracting officer to make a decision on that. I think the biggest issue, and I think what we've really heard here today, is really related to Federal Highway Administration and that guidance, because that does flow down to, as you heard, the state agencies. And I think that's really where the majority of the angst and the concern is, that without additional guidance and recommendations to state agencies, there's going to be unintended consequences longer term than just this year.
So just to clarify that, Ms. Moser, you're saying that the clarification should be in some recommendation from Congress with regard to the PPP program, but then also instruct the state and local agencies as such as well, both steps.
Well, I don't think necessarily that Congress has other than trying to get the agencies to issue the guidance. I think that's really what's needed. And then really it's the guidance that they issue, because all of the state agencies are looking to Federal Highway Administration for guidance. So I think really it's the guidance is needed with clarity from the Highway Administration.
Thank you for clarifying that. I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, at this time, recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Moser.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks all to the testifiers. Appreciate it. Yeah, it is an important subject. Clearly, a very financially important situation that needs clarification, no question. So, may I ask, and I'll start with Ms. Moser, and I'll also ask others as well. What was understood by you at the time that you submitted for what was described as forgivable business loan? Was it understood that this was to be completely forgivable under the conditions of retaining your employees?
Hi, since you asked me to address first, so I am an advisor to, I'm a partner in an accounting firm, and so I advise clients, so I was not applying for a PPP loan. I think like just with most of our clients at the time, it was a lifeline. And so I think most companies, had no idea what was going to happen. And so did apply. And that was generally our recommendation. Obviously, there's been much guidance since then. But I think the forgiveness issue is really for contractors. There has been much analysis and angst, frankly, on whether they should or should not apply for forgiveness, again, depending on really their contract mix in terms of what how that's going
So
to
you advise that, yes, they should take the loans under the understanding of the requirements for PPP, and therefore it would be forgivable if they lived up to those requirements.
Yes, generally, if they met the requirements, yes.
Mr. Penin, is that what you understood from the original language of the provision in the legislation?
Congressman Moser, thank you very much. Yes, that was our understanding. And as I mentioned in my testimony, this was our lifeline. And then the interpretation came after the fact. And that's what I think that's kind of where we are today. There was an interpretation given after the fact, and that's kind of what surprised a number of us in that situation. Yes,
okay.
sir.
And I realize there are many, many dynamics and factors facing a business, any business, engineering, contracting, whatever it might be, particularly with pandemic coming along, particularly even in my state where outdoor construction was shut down for a while with state contracts, government contracts, with employees not able to come in out of fear, out of having COVID, out of family members, out of children at home. So it was a very upheaval period. So I'm certainly on the side of small business. But let me ask you this: if there is a guaranteed revenue stream that would be ascertained and made clear, the whole idea behind PPP was to sustain a small business during a loss of revenue period for the purpose of not letting their employees go, losing them over the short term and the long term, and not having them go on unemployment. Now, that being the case, is all your business, by the way, contracted under this way, or is it just a percentage? Is it 50% of your revenue comes from the contracts that are affecting the potential PPP?
Yes, sir. I assume the question is for me. Yes, sir. I would say that the majority of our work comes from government contracting. We're a small company. Most of that is as a subcontract to larger state and national or international companies. But it passes down to us because we still have to go through our FDOT, in our case, audit, and that's where this interpretation is going to be implemented. So yes, sir. Most of our business is government based. It's what gives us the long-term contracts are essential for small businesses because of the stability that it provides.
Right. I'm just trying to get to where the revenue loss. Did you suffer revenue loss during this time period?
Yes, we did. Yes, we kept our employees. We kept our employees, but we had tremendous losses in revenue because we came to a screeching halt.
Okay. Well, that pretty much answers my question then, and should uncover any doubts. The original intent of this PPP for you should be upheld. What about the second round of the PPP? Did you apply for that?
We have not applied for that. We have not applied for that.
Okay, very good. Mr. Chairman, I don't have any more questions. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moser. We're going to start the second round of questioning, and I will lead that off by asking Mr. Bingham if he would help put some context into this discussion. I think we all know what the purpose or the stated purpose of FAR 31 is, but can you tell me when the principles of FAR or Part 31 kick in? Is there a certain requirement, number of requirements, or something else that you might be able to share with us in terms of its implementation?
Yes. Thank you for the question. The requirements of FAR 31 kick in when there is a sole source, or when there's procurement of a cost reimbursement contract or a sole source procurement, where it's a situation where the contractor has to provide cost information, the cost estimate to the government customer. And so it's under circumstances of that nature. If a contractor, if there is a sealed bids, in other words, there's adequate competition, then the government buyer is supposed to base its decisions on the price offered by various competent contractors, and not get into what their cost history is, or what their indirect costs are, or their direct costs, any of that type of information. That's the way they're intended to focus it. And I'll just add to the discussion about the indirect cost rates. The intended approach in the FAR with regard to future indirect cost rates is not that you just take the indirect rate for a past year and assume that it will be matched going forward. That would be contrary, in my interpretation, to both the FAR and the audit guidance from the DCAA, for example. And so the issues seem to be related to this idea that some agencies, some state-related agencies, are just forcing a situation where whatever the past indirect rate was, that indirect rate will be all that is allowed in some future year. I hope I answered your question.
You did, but I'm going to ask you to step out on a limb and tell us how you would fix this if you had the ability to do so overnight.
Yeah, I think I agree with Ms. Moser in the idea of guidance. I think if it's the state departments of transportation, if they did more what the federal government auditors do, the DCA auditors do, looking at the guidance there it's in FAR 42 and 44, I believe, and then not this recent DCAA memorandum to regional directors, but back to the DCAA's contract audit manual on how you audit indirect rates and how you audit forward pricing rates, these indirect rates that are going into the future. If they follow that type of guidance, my impression is that would solve a lot of this. I don't think they're following that type of guidance right now. I think it sounds like they're imposing that the same, past indirect rate must be used going forward. So that would be I'm out on a limb. That's about as far out on the limb as I'll go. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. I want to yield to the ranking member, Ms. Salazar.
And I think this question is for Mr. Bingham and for Mrs. Moser as well, and Mr. Penin, three of you. If by any chance this interpretation of the FAR stance and the DOD doesn't change the way it sees the way that they do business with you, in which way not only will it affect your decision to continue working with the government, or will you then decide to seek other work in the private sector alone? How will this change your future is basically what I would like to hear from you. And we start with you, Mr. Penin.
Thank you very much for the question. If the interpretation of the FAR stands, it'll adversely affect our multiplier and therefore our ability to continue to work on government contracts. I mentioned earlier, in our particular case, it would be approximately 25% of our multiplier would be affected. We would go from whatever 1.25 to 1.0, and that is a huge impact on our business. The minority companies and small businesses rely on government because of the long-term contracts that we can obtain from government. In this case, if this rate were to go on for further years, then we would be punished by the same percentage for multiple year contracts, and in some cases, it would impact multiple contracts. So for us, that would be a deterrent from pursuing government contracts. The private sector is on a rebound. Whether we would concentrate on that alone would have to be a financial decision that I'm not 100% sure right now that I can make. But we see that if we can't rely on one, we have to be resilient. That's what makes us survive. I told you we've been in business for 32 years. So we will look for whatever opportunity we can to get to the next year and the next year and so forth and so on. But I would say that it would certainly impact our ability our desire to contract with government under those conditions. Thank you.
Mrs. Moser.
So again, I don't contract directly with the government. I just advise companies that do. So So I'm really not in a position to address the issue.
What would be your advice to those clients? What would be your advice?
So again, I really think the issue, if the Federal Highway Administration issued guidance, each of the state agencies, and our firm does these indirect rate audits for many engineering firms and deals with many state auditors. The state DOT agencies are looking for guidance from, we've reached out to all of them. They are asking for guidance from Federal Highway Administration. So I think absent any guidance, then they feel like they don't really have a choice on what they do. So I really think Highway providing guidance and recommendations on what is the purpose of the indirect rate audit and how should it be used going forward into future.
I'm going to interrupt you so I can give the opportunity to Mrs. Greenleaf, which I didn't recognize, and then to Mr. Bingham.
Thank you for the
2 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity to respond. I think that the one point I'd like to make is when I took my PPP loan, it was really under enormous duress. Our business was disrupted. We had to work remotely. And the idea that we would end up as part of a very, very small sector of the entire PPP universe that would not be able to take full advantage of the PPP loan and the original intent is what's driving my being here today. And so, I agree with what Ms. Moser is saying about, good guidance coming from Federal Highway being a possible step in the right direction. But I think for ACEC, what I'd like to drive home is that we would like to be treated like every other company that took a PPP loan out.
Minute, 35 seconds to Mr. Bingham.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to respond. I will just say that, and I am an advisor to companies as well, but I think the guidance in FAR 42.7 and the DCAA's guidance on this point about the indirect rates, that you don't blindly accept a past year as the future year and forecast that into the future. I think if a government entity was telling me that they were going to force me to have the same rate in the past as the future, I think I may well be able to read them passages from FAR 42.7 in the DCA audit manual to show them why that's inappropriate. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to recognize Member Stalber. He just joined us, Chairman.
Yes, I will do that in his turn. He actually, for the record, was with us earlier and stepped away. So we're glad that you're back, Mr. Stalber. The chair at this point will recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Newman, for the second round. Ms. Newman? Okay. Are you back with us? Okay, so let's do this. I will go to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stalber, and then come back to Ms. Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for all the witnesses. I really appreciate your time. At a time when our small businesses are trying to recover from the crisis, so for our small contractors, the continued changes in guidance and memorandums from government agencies have caused a lot of headache and confusion. Mr. Penin, what is your reaction or your thoughts to the government's motive of prevention of double dipping?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I don't believe that double dipping applies, and I say that simply because when we applied for the PPP loan and we processed our paperwork for forgiveness, we consider that as a self-standing item and not something that we were going to be penalized for later.
Okay, thank you. My next question for Ms. Greenleaf, given your position with ACEC, what are you seeing from this particular group of businesses Are many of them seeking loan forgiveness or not? And have any of your members decided to forego forgiveness or even give the loans back due to this confusion?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and thank you for answering it. I think our members are waiting to see what comes out of Federal Highway for final guidance. For me, I did apply for forgiveness, and my firm did receive it. But I've been checking with colleagues, and it's a very inconsistent approach. People would like to apply for forgiveness. They'd like to understand the ramifications if they do. Some of the smaller firms like mine, I may have to make some business decisions about who my clients might be for the next year or two. And I also want to point out that on top of the need to really reach a conclusion that we can all make decisions from is the fact that the administration is trying to push a very, very large and serious infrastructure bill out over the summer. And we're the firms that will be hopefully having a part in designing all of these new transportation projects that may come out. And yet, if what we're having to do is knowing that we're getting into these at a potentially greatly reduced rate, it's a very, very difficult position to be in.
Thank you. And then, Ms. Greenleaf, again, could you speak to how this could impact small businesses working on state and local transportation projects?
Yeah, so a firm like mine, we've already done the math. I know what the reduction in overhead rate and corresponding hourly rates will be if I choose to continue to work for our state DOT. And for me, they're a very valued client, and I want to find a way to continue supporting them. Many of the larger projects at the state level are comprised of very large teams. So it could have very large engineering firms that are driving the projects, but the team is very diverse, and there might be 10 firms just like mine that are all seeking to gain experience on large projects. So it's a big impact.
Right. Well, I look forward to discussions on the infrastructure project. I certainly hope it's bipartisan, and I certainly hope that the minority has input on it because I think it has a potential to be really good legislation. We know that it's been needed, and we just want to have input on it. So, Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and I yield back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stauber. I'm going to attempt to go to Ms. Newman again. I don't know if she has her speaker system on. I've seen her go by her camera a couple times. And Ms. Newman, are you there? Well, I guess she is not. Chair recognizes Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions at this time. I would yield back. Thank you.
Okay. And Ms. Salazar, any further comments from you?
I think that we have gathered a lot of information, and between you and I, we definitely will sit and figure out how we can make this work for the private sector without with more clarification, as some of them have said, and with the accounting process having been reviewed. And I think that's our duty and our job, to make it easy for them, for the private sector, and at the same time avoid any type of double dipping, which is that's what we're here for. So looking forward to work with you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Well stated, and the feeling is mutual. I want to thank you again. I want to also thank all of our witnesses who've made time to be with us. Your expert testimony, in my opinion, has been invaluable and given the members of this subcommittee a greater understanding of how this complex issue impacts small businesses. Small contractors, as we all know, have been devastated by this pandemic. And so it's important that we ensure that they are not inflicted with any further harm. And at a minimum, we must ensure consistency in the application of the rules that govern federal contracting. So I look forward to working with today's witnesses and subcommittee members to find a path forward so that we might be able to come up with an equitable solution for these small businesses. And I would ask, as I mentioned earlier, unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record, and without objection, it is so ordered. If there is no further business to come before the committee, we officially stand adjourned. Thank you all. Have a good day.